Greetings and salutations, everyone. My name is Andrew Kirchhoff, and welcome to my YouTube channel. Today, I'm going to be talking about my Week 12 running back rankings for the 2023 fantasy football season. Over the course of today's episode, I'm covering all topics related to the running back position, beginning with matchups, talking about which defenses are allowing the most fantasy points per game to opposing running backs so that we can identify the most advantageous matchups going into Week 12. After which, I'll go ahead and present my top 36 running back rankings, sharing with you guys my thought process and opinions on each individual player, while also going ahead and presenting statistics in order to justify those overall rankings. Before we get into today's episode, a couple reminders and announcements. If you're looking for a specific player, there are timestamps down in the description of the video. While you're down there, if you have yet to do so already, be sure to subscribe to the channel. We're making daily fantasy football content for the entirety of the 2023 season. Now, speaking of the daily content, instead of posting 2 videos today, I'll be posting my wide receiver rankings video tomorrow, and on Thursday morning, prior to the first game of the day, which begins at 9:30 a.m. Pacific Standard Time, I'll be live streaming here on the channel starting at 7 a.m. PST. Throughout that entire live stream, I'll have rankings on screen for the tight end, wide receiver, running back, and quarterback positions. So instead of posting a quarterback and tight end rankings video, you can find the rankings there prior to the first Thursday game. I'll have the rankings top 16 capacity in both overall positions, so you can go ahead and set your lineups accordingly. I'll be live streaming for about 2.5 hours. So for any of you who have questions and or need help setting your lineups, be sure to swing on by Thursday morning starting at 7 a.m. Pacific Standard Time. The final announcement I wanted to make before we get into today's video is in regards to the 1.01 brand, the official merchandise line of the Andrew Kirchhoff YouTube channel. For the next week, from now until next Monday, all hoodies on the website, andrewkirchhoffshop.com, a link can be found down in the description of the video, will be 25% off. So for those of you who are interested in terms of supporting the channel, finding yourself high quality, comfortable, and stylish clothing for your most stressful fantasy football Sundays, be sure to go ahead, check out the link down in the description. Again, 25% off all hoodies. Again, thank you very much. This is the Thanksgiving sale that we'll have until next Monday. Greatly appreciated. Okay, let's talk about running backs and specifically matchups. As you guys can see to the right side of the screen, we have 2023 running back rushing statistics allowed, but I've gone ahead and changed the parameters to weeks 5 through 11. Therefore, throughout that span of time, the Carolina Panthers are allowing the most fantasy points per game to opposing running backs in terms of running back rushing statistics isolated. That's rushing yards and rushing touchdowns. Of course, they're giving up 18.13 fantasy points per game. So regardless of what scoring format you play in, standard, half PPR, full PPR, these statistics apply across the board. Now, of course, we want to take advantage of the matchup against the Carolina Panthers. Derrick Henry should have himself a fantastic bounce back performance. The Arizona Cardinals, Kyren Williams, coming off of his injury, should have himself a great performance. The thumbnail of today's episode, taking on the Indianapolis Colts, Rachaad White should be able to dominate there. Either way, these are the most advantageous matchups. I'll refer back to these statistics over the course of today's video, but some of the more disadvantageous matchups, ones that we might want to avoid, maybe near the bottom of the list. The Chicago Bears, the Jacksonville Jaguars, Tampa Bay Buccaneers, Atlanta Falcons. I mean, the Falcons and the Buccaneers haven't allowed a rushing touchdown to a running back throughout weeks 5 through 11. That gives you a little bit of an understanding just how well they have played in terms of stopping the run. Either way, again, like I mentioned, I'll refer back to these statistics over the course of today's video. Let's get into talking about my top 36 running back rankings. For those of you who are trying to stay up to date on my latest rankings, because again, rankings are subject to change between now and Sunday. These rankings can absolutely and 100% will change. Therefore, be sure to go ahead, travel down to the description, and get my rankings sent to you every single Sunday morning for the remainder of the season via Underdog Fantasy. When you sign up using code Andrew, making that first-time deposit minimum of $10, not only are you going to get the first-time deposit match up to $100, I'll be sending you my rankings every single Sunday morning, which is by position, by tier, flex rankings, half PPR, full PPR. These rankings will be sent to you from my email directly to yours, so be sure to check your spam folder every single Sunday morning. But considering there are literally 3 games taking place on Thursday, I'll also be sending those rankings this Thursday on top of it. So for those of you who are interested in taking advantage of the opportunity, check out the map to the right side of the screen to determine your eligibility based on your location and take advantage of the opportunity today. And if you do so before Sunday night's game between the Seattle Seahawks and of course San Francisco 49ers, you can take advantage of Christian McCaffrey, 0.5 total yards. Thank you very much. Okay, speaking of Christian McCaffrey, he's our number 1 running back going into this week, of course. Not really a surprise there. Christian McCaffrey takes on the Seattle Seahawks, has been a dominant force for fantasy purposes, finally got back on his streak of scoring a touchdown, was able to get himself a receiving touchdown, but this isn't the first time he's been able to do it. In terms of his most recent performances, in the last 3 games, he's accompanied his performances with 17 total receptions and 2 receiving touchdowns. On top of the rushing touchdown upside that is always implicated with his overall performances, being able to get himself another week in which he has 5+ receptions, that's 3 in a row. That share of opportunity is just as many receptions guys like Brandon Ayuk and Deebo Samuel get within this offense. Of course, Christian McCaffrey is our number 1. Moving on to our number 2, we have Travis Etienne, who takes on the Houston Texans. Travis Etienne had himself a lackluster performance, primarily because, unfortunately, Trevor Lawrence had 2 rushing touchdowns. Yes, Travis Etienne had 14 rushing attempts, 3 receptions, 17 total touches, but unfortunately didn't have a touchdown accompany his performance in order to elevate his overall production. Throughout the entire course of the season, typically it has been Travis Etienne that has hurt Trevor Lawrence, but this time around, it was the complete opposite. Trevor Lawrence, 2 rushing touchdowns down in the red zone. That obviously made an impact, but that's going to be a rare instance throughout the remainder of the season. So going forward, my expectation against the Houston Texans, a matchup in which earlier this season, Travis Etienne had 15.8 half PPR fantasy points without even a single touchdown scored within that game. 19 carries for 88 yards. 4 receptions for 50 receiving yards. Had himself a great game. My expectation is a big performance here against a division rival. Moving on to our number 3, we have Jonathan Taylor. Even though he does take on one of the more disadvantageous matchups at the position, you have to understand that what we saw last time out of Jonathan Taylor in Germany against the New England Patriots is the Jonathan Taylor I expect to see for the remainder of the season. In that game, he had a season-high 23 rushing attempts. On top of it, Zach Moss only played 16% of the overall offensive snaps, while Jonathan Taylor played 88% of the overall offensive snaps. My expectation going up against the Tampa Bay Buccaneers is that if we're going to see a greater opportunity share of Jonathan Taylor, we're probably going to see the Jonathan Taylor of 2021 reprise his role and, of course, be a dominant force within this offense, which, of course, has found a lot of success. There's a reason why, in the absence of Jonathan Taylor, Zach Moss was such a dominant force for fantasy purposes. I can't wait to see what Jonathan Taylor is capable of with 20+ touches every single week. Moving on to our number 4, we have Austin Ekeler. Austin Ekeler, similar to a Travis Etienne, had himself a very underwhelming performance, but that primarily had to do with the fact that he fumbled quite literally on the 2-yard line. Justin Herbert literally handed him off the ball. He tripped, he got up, he fumbled. There was an opportunity there for him to score a rushing touchdown and make his overall week and continue his streak of scoring a touchdown, but it is what it is. Throughout that entire game, the Los Angeles Chargers, specifically down in the red zone, weren't great. They were 0 for 2 in terms of goal-to-go situations, and they were 1 for 4 in terms of scoring in the red zone. That is not a recipe for fantasy success, especially for Austin Ekeler, and especially considering he only had 3 targets, 2 receptions for 6 receiving yards in a game in which they desperately needed a number 2 receiving option. I'm hoping that we'll get far more receiving utilization out of Austin Ekeler, especially in a tough matchup taking on the Baltimore Ravens this week. Our number 5 for this week is Alvin Kamara. Prior to his bye week, he's been averaging 16.9 fantasy points per game and a half PPR scoring format and dominating. Now, in the last 2 games, unfortunately, he has only had 9 rushing attempts in each game, and that's obviously a factor of game script and Taysom Hill's overall usage. Of course, when Taysom Hill is getting himself, 10 rushing attempts within a singular game, it's absolutely going to impact the overall potential of Alvin Kamara. But luckily for Alvin Kamara, he continues to get himself goal line opportunity. He's going to continue to see himself a huge workload of opportunity within this backfield in terms of rushing attempts, but also he's been able to get himself 4 or more receptions in 6 of the last 7 games he has played within this offense. Taking on the Atlanta Falcons, I understand that they haven't allowed a rushing touchdown to a running back. I think this is the week in which it breaks. Moving on to our number 6 to begin the A tier, we have Derrick Henry. Derrick Henry takes on the Carolina Panthers. It is literally the best matchup at the position. They're allowing over 18 fantasy points per game in terms of rushing statistics isolated. What more could we ask for Derrick Henry? Now, I understand that this Tennessee Titans offense has been terrible as of late. In the last 3 games, they're 11 of 35 in terms of third down conversions. That's a 31% conversion rate. When the quarterback of an offense isn't able to move the chains with his arm, oftentimes what we'll see in first and second down scenarios is a lot of stacked boxes. Thus far this season, Derrick Henry has faced the highest percentage of stacked boxes with 8+ defenders amongst all running backs in the National Football League. 42.41% of the time, 8+ defenders in the box against Derrick Henry. Hopefully, we'll see a greater performance from the quarterback, Will Levis, which will only allow Derrick Henry to be an even more impactful player within this given game. Moving on to our number 7, we have Jahmyr Gibbs. Jahmyr Gibbs has been great, and when I went ahead and I watched this game back, he dominated drives 2, 4, and 6. Pretty much every other drive, they're switching off overall opportunities. But in these drives in which they give full workload to Jahmyr Gibbs, we have no sign of David Montgomery. So in drives 2, 4, and 6, it was all Gibbs, no sign of Montgomery. And of course, Gibbs did his damage, had himself a lot of opportunity on the ground through the air, and was able to put up another big performance of 18.5 fantasy points while playing a dominant share of the overall offensive snaps. Now, there were a couple opportunities in that game for Jahmyr Gibbs to have even more production. In fact, the second to last offensive play of the game for the Detroit Lions, Jahmyr Gibbs ran it down to the 1 yard line. The following play, David Montgomery came into the game, scored the game-winning touchdown. There was an opportunity there in which they could have just handed it off to Jahmyr Gibbs. He could have scored the rushing touchdown, been 24 plus fantasy points within the given week. Either way, they take on the Green Bay Packers this week. Both these running backs are going to find success, primarily because the last time they took on the Green Bay Packers, they had 40 rushing attempts for 161 rushing yards and 3 rushing touchdowns. I'm expecting a lot of big things here from Gibbs and Montgomery. We'll talk about Montgomery in just a moment. Moving on to our number 8, we have Bijan Robinson, a running back that just a couple weeks ago was given a full reign of opportunity. Back in week 9 against the Arizona Cardinals, 22 rushing attempts for 95 rushing yards, 1 rushing touchdown, 2 targets, 1 catch, 11 receiving yards, 17.1 fantasy points. Not only is that a career high or season high of rushing attempts from Bijan Robinson, he was given a running attempt inside the 10-yard line that led to a rushing touchdown. That's all we can ask for. As long as the Atlanta Falcons are pushing in the direction of making this a 70 or 80-20 split, 70-30 split within this backfield, giving vast majority of the overall rushing attempts in the direction of Bijan Robinson, who has been extremely effective with his overall touches. As long as that's going to be the case, regardless of who they're playing against, he's going to find himself a lot of success for fantasy purposes. Moving on to our number 9, we have Saquon Barkley. Saquon Barkley had a surprising 28 fantasy points and a half PPR, primarily because of the receiving workload. Now, as of late, that offensive line has been battered, injured, and are missing a bunch of starters. And despite that overall fact, against the Washington Commanders, they put up another great performance, but specifically in the receiving game, 5 targets, 4 catches, 57 receiving yards, 2 receiving touchdowns for Saquon Barkley, who played 91% of the overall offensive snaps, had 19 touches. And honestly, as long as you're going to score 2 touchdowns in any capacity, you're going to be relevant for fantasy purposes. They take on the New England Patriots. Luckily for the Giants, the New England Patriots offense is so terrible that they're never going to impose a negative game script upon Saquon Barkley and the New York Giants. So he'll be rushing for majority of the game, playing over 90% of the offensive snaps. He'll probably get himself upwards of 15 rushing attempts, get himself a sprinkle of receiving work. As long as he finds the end zone, despite this offensive line being, battered and injured, I'm expecting Saquon Barkley to be relevant for fantasy purposes. Moving on, let's talk about our number 10. We have DeAndre Swift. In the last 9 consecutive games, he has surpassed 15 or more touches. That load of opportunity is incredible. And as long as he continues to put together performances with explosive runs and receptions after the catch, what more can we ask for? On top of that, he takes on the Buffalo Bills this week. It's more of an advantageous matchup. Of course, over the course of the season, due to all the injuries that the Buffalo Bills defense has had, especially Matt Milano missing as their middle linebacker, that makes a huge difference in terms of stopping the run. They've struggled in that overall capacity. As a run-first approach from the Philadelphia Eagles, I expect a lot of success from DeAndre Swift, especially with the volume of opportunity he's being given. The only thing we have to hope for is that his rushing touchdown isn't stolen this upcoming week. Typically, it has been Kenneth Gainwell or Jalen Hurts last night, 2 rushing touchdowns. In any sort of capacity that could take place in which the rushing touchdown, which typically would be within the scoreline and box score of DeAndre Swift, can be taken away with one singular play, as long as they're in a position to go ahead and use the brotherly shove. Moving on to our number 11 to close out the A tier. And the thumbnail of today's episode, we have Rachaad White. Rachaad White in the last 5 games is averaging 16.96 fantasy points per game and a half PPR. He has scored 4 touchdowns in the last 3 games. In the last 5 games, he has 25 receptions, so 5 per game on average, and 256 receiving yards, averaging over 10 yards per reception in the last 5 games. On top of that, takes on the Indianapolis Colts. The Colts are allowing the 3rd most fantasy points per game to opposing running backs, 17.35 since week 5, allowing 4.06 yards per attempt. And just earlier today, released Shaq Leonard from their defense. They waived him, so my expectation is a big performance here out of the running back of the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. Our number 12 to close out the RB1 conversation, we have David Montgomery. Like I mentioned with Jahmyr Gibbs plays every other series at a full capacity. Now, David Montgomery is the primary running back, specifically in last week's game against the Chicago Bears in drive 1, 3, 5, and 7. Now, every time that they're in a 3rd down scenario, they pull out David Montgomery. Every time that they went ahead and they went to an empty formation, whether it was 1st, 2nd, or 3rd down, even 4th down scenarios, anytime they go into an empty formation, Jahmyr Gibbs comes in. So regardless of the fact that he's the primary running back in these drives, there were some instances in this game, specifically I think it was drive 3 or 5, in which, of course, David Montgomery is the primary back. They go down into the red zone. They get into this, empty set, 5 wide. They get down to the goal line, and then because Jahmyr Gibbs is in the game, they maintain him in the game, and he gets the rushing touchdown within that overall drive, despite David Montgomery starting it out. Either way, 2-minute drills are often dominated also by Jahmyr Gibbs. David Montgomery is pretty much going to play 40% of the offensive snaps going forward. If it wasn't for the fact that they literally pulled Jahmyr Gibbs out of the game on the final play to allow David Montgomery to get the rushing touchdown, he wouldn't have had it. But nonetheless, this week they take on the Green Bay Packers. it is an advantageous matchup. Last time out, we saw David Montgomery dominate against his defense with over 100 rushing yards and 3 touchdowns. We're hoping for a big performance here at a top 12 capacity. Moving on, let's talk about our number 13. We have Tony Pollard. The only reason Tony Pollard scored a touchdown was because it was a 20-yard plus rushing attempt. If it wasn't for the fact that it was 20 or more yards, I don't think he would have found the end zone in this game. This offensive line down in the red zone, first and foremost, isn't asked to run block very much, and even when they do it terribly. The expectation this week against the Washington Commanders is that hopefully Tony Pollard will be given an opportunity in which he can break out another huge run and find himself in the end zone. Rico Dowdle, of course, still dealing with that injury. With less opportunities going in his direction, of course, Tony Pollard will still continue to be a mainstay within this offense and hopefully will get himself even more utilization within the receiving game due to Rico Dowdle's overall absence. Moving on to our number 14, we have Gus Edwards. In 5 consecutive games, he has scored at least 1 touchdown minimum. He has scored himself 9 touchdowns in the last 5 games he has played for the Baltimore Ravens. He has been a top 10 ranked running back in 4 of the last 5 games that he has played. The fact that I'm ranking him as number 14, I will honestly say is a disservice. But again, when you're so touchdown dependent, it does become difficult to trust a running back of this caliber, especially when he's only playing 38% of the offensive snaps, and Keaton Mitchell is beginning to dig into his overall workload. There's always a potential that he could steal a touchdown in the future. Moving on to our number 15, we have Bijan Robinson Jr. We don't know the status of Antonio Gibson, but considering they play on Thursday, my expectation is that Antonio Gibson may not be available to play. So going into this week with the potential of Antonio Gibson not playing and the fact that Bijan Robinson Jr. has had himself 13 receptions in the last 2 games, coming off a performance in which he didn't even score a touchdown and still had 16.6 fantasy points and a half PPR scoring format, nearly playing 80% of the offensive snaps. My expectation with a full workload of opportunity coming off a week in which he had 9 total targets, 7 receptions, would be that he's going to have himself a great performance. I do expect that the Washington Commanders play the Dallas Cowboys tough as they have over the last couple of years. I mean, the last time they took each other on, week 18 of last year, Sam Howell, as a starting quarterback in his first ever NFL start, was able to beat the Dallas Cowboys in that overall contest. Moving on to our number 16, we have Josh Jacobs. Yesterday, the media asked Las Vegas Raiders head coach Antonio Pierce whether he liked the overall usage of Josh Jacobs in Sunday's game against the Miami Dolphins, where he only had himself 14 rushing attempts and 1 reception, 15 total touches. He said that his magic number was 20 plus rushing attempts for Josh Jacobs. He's one of the best running backs in the National Football League, and they want to use him at a greater capacity. If that's going to be the case going into this upcoming weekend's matchup against the Kansas City Chiefs, the Chiefs are allowing 12.35 fantasy points per game in terms of rushing statistics isolated, but they're also allowing 4.84 yards per attempt since week 5. My expectation is a greater workload from Josh Jacobs, but if in fact this offense is going to continue to turn over the ball, taking on a tough defense, I think his entire performance is going to be contingent on whether or not he falls into the end zone. We're hoping for that to be the case. Moving on to our number 17, speaking of falling into the end zone, someone who has done that on multiple occasions this season. Due to the injury to Devon Etienne on Sunday, my expectation, especially considering they play on a Friday game, is that Devon Etienne most likely is not going to be active. If in fact he does play, we're still going to rank Raheem Mostert higher, but of course there is a potential in which we could end up throwing Devon Etienne out there depending on who you have within your running back room. Nonetheless, going into this week against the New York Jets, my expectation is that of course they're going to run the ball a bunch. Of course, 15 plus rushing attempts should be on the menu for Raheem Mostert. All we really do need is a rushing touchdown or a receiving touchdown. That pretty much solidifies his week to 13 to 15 points every single game. That's all we need. Outside of that, he's probably a 10-point player for fantasy purposes. Moving on to our number 18, we have Kyren Williams, who's coming off of his injury. But the last time we saw Kyren Williams, prior to his injury, the guy was averaging 17.43 fantasy points per game, 16 rushing attempts per game, 76 rushing yards per game, a rushing touchdown per game on average, 4 targets, 2 receptions, 18 receiving yards per game, and playing 82% of the offensive snaps for the Los Angeles Rams. Now that he's returning into the lineup, taking on the Arizona Cardinals, again, the Arizona Cardinals are allowing 4.11 yards per attempt, and since week 5, they're allowing 17.5 fantasy points per game to opposing running backs in terms of rushing statistics isolated. With Cooper Kupp potentially not going to be active this upcoming Sunday, there's an even bigger emphasis on potentially running the ball in an advantageous matchup taking on the Arizona Cardinals. Moving on to our number 19, we have Breece Hall. The reason why Breece Hall sits in this conversation is because of his last 5 games of rushing totals: 23, 28, 50, 17, and 39. His offensive line is battered. Mekhi Becton with an injury on Sunday. If in fact this offensive line is going to have backups across the board, whether they're second string or third string, it doesn't matter. He really can't run the ball because his offensive line truly isn't helping him on those rushing attempts. Therefore, the only thing that we can hope for is Tim Boyle wants to target him in the receiving game. If in fact Breece Hall doesn't get receiving upside within this overall performance, he will be far worse than number 19 overall. Last week had himself 10 carries for 23, 6 targets, 5 receptions, 50 receiving yards, and a receiving touchdown. Majority of that work done in the first half of the game. We just have to hope that Tim Boyle likes to target his running backs, and going into this week will continue to look in the direction of the best offensive player on that team, Breece Hall. Moving on to our number 20, we have Jaylen Warren. Jaylen Warren is not the starter of this offense. Now, maybe the offensive coordinator change is going to change some things up, and maybe Jaylen Warren is going to be given the starting workload. But, we saw on Sunday against the Cleveland Browns, the first overall snap, Najee Harris in the game, the first overall rushing attempt at Najee Harris. The overall announcement of, hey, Jaylen Warren is our starter is more of a symbolism, like prior to the game, him coming out of the tunnel. Oh, our starting running back, Jaylen Warren. Anyway, regardless of that, going forward, we're hoping that he's going to get more touches, because the way that he played on Sunday, having a 74-yard rushing attempt and then also having a rushing attempt of 5, 8, 11, 12, and 21 rushing yards is unbelievable. I know that Mike Tomlin on Monday said that he was satisfied with the overall workload that Jaylen Warren was given, but let's be totally honest, he is just more efficient than Najee Harris. He should get more touches, and we're hoping that's going to be the case, especially in an advantageous matchup taking on the Cincinnati Bengals this week. Moving on to our number 21, we have Isiah Pacheco. Isiah Pacheco had 20 total touches. And if it wasn't for the fact that Travis Kelce fumbled the ball on that drive down in the red zone, that honestly looked like a drive in which it could have potentially ended with an Isiah Pacheco rushing touchdown. Nonetheless, going forward into this week against the Las Vegas Raiders, they are the 5th best matchup. They're allowing 16.07 fantasy points per game in terms of rushing statistics isolated since week 5, and they're allowing 4.47 yards per attempt to opposing running backs. My expectation within this given week is a lot of rushing attempts from Isiah Pacheco across the board and finding himself a lot of success. Moving on to our number 22, we have Rhamondre Stevenson. Rhamondre Stevenson's been able to surpass 85 rushing yards in each of the last 2 games. He's been able to accumulate 3+ receptions in 4 of the last 5 games. Opportunities are going to be there for Rhamondre Stevenson. The only thing that holds him back is the quarterback play. The quarterback is not able to get them down into the red zone. And because of that, Rhamondre Stevenson doesn't have as much touchdown upside. Hopefully, they'll be in a negative game script, which will force Rhamondre Stevenson to get himself more receiving utilization out of this backfield. They do take on the New York Giants. That's the 4th best matchup in terms of allowing fantasy points per game to opposing running backs since week 5, over 16.5. On top of it, they're allowing 4.78 yards per attempt. Rhamondre Stevenson's in a great position in terms of matchup. We just have to hope that the New England Patriots offense coming off of the bye week looks far better than they did in Germany. Moving on. Our number 23, Javonte Williams. Javonte Williams had a little bit of a lackluster performance. Obviously didn't find himself in the end zone and didn't see much, overall workload in terms of touches in comparison to the 3 weeks prior. There was a lot of utilization of Samaje Perine within the receiving game, which definitely is worrisome. And there is always going to be a running back rotation with Jaleel McLaughlin, Samaje Perine, and Javonte Williams, but we're hoping for more overall opportunity. This week, they take on the Cleveland Browns. If, in fact, the Cleveland secondary forces a lot of trouble in the direction of Russell Wilson, hopefully they'll continue to lean upon the running game in order to mount a lead. The Cleveland Browns, since week 5, they're allowing 4.8 yards per attempt to opposing running backs. They're the 9th best matchup in terms of fantasy points per game. We're hoping for Javonte Williams to be given ample opportunity despite the matchup. Moving on to our number 24, we have Joe Mixon. Joe Mixon will have Jake Browning as a starting quarterback. This is going to be a run-first offense going forward in my mind, especially considering Joe Mixon in the last 4 games has scored a touchdown. They're continuing to lean upon him, and he's finding a lot of success for this offense. I distinctly remember back in 2020 when Joe Burrow went down with his ACL injury that there was a Thursday night football game where Ryan Finley was the starting quarterback of the Cincinnati Bengals. They took on, I think, an undefeated Pittsburgh Steelers team, if I'm not mistaken, in that game. Maybe they weren't undefeated. Maybe they were 11-1. Either way, I remember that Ryan Finley led this offense to a 27-17 victory against the Pittsburgh Steelers. Anything is possible. Giovanni Bernard in that game had a monster performance. Why not Joe Mixon? I think he'll have himself a solid week within the overall matchup. Moving on. Our number 25 is James Cook. After firing Ken Dorsey, their former offensive coordinator, all of a sudden we see far more utilization go in the direction of James Cook. James Cook had a season-high 17 rushing attempts for 73 rushing yards. A huge workload of opportunity. 4 overall targets, 3 receptions, 29 receiving yards, and a receiving touchdown. As long as the Buffalo Bills continue to treat him as their RB1, as he deserves to be, considering he's the most effective back out of this backfield, as long as they continue to give him an ample load of opportunity, 20 total touches, last Sunday against the New York Jets, taking on the Philadelphia Eagles. I know that the Philadelphia Eagles matchup isn't the greatest, but they are technically allowing 4.56 yards per attempt to opposing running backs, whether it's on the ground, through the air. James Cook has a lot of potential for upside this week. Moving on to our number 26, we have Zach Charbonnet, the rookie running back, playing in the absence of Kenneth Walker. Of course, Kenneth Walker only played 7 snaps prior to leaving the game with an oblique injury. If in fact that injury is going to sustain a longer toll on him, and he's not going to play this upcoming Thursday, again, it is a short week, Zach Charbonnet would be the expected starter within the game. Now, there is also the question of whether or not Geno Smith is going to be available for the game. Of course, he's dealing with a tricep injury that was reported by Pete Carroll, the head coach, when asked about it on Monday. So if that tricep injury is going to be a problem, that's not great. If Kenneth Walker is not going to be available, obviously for many of us, that's not great. But hopefully you have Zach Charbonnet. You've already picked him up over the course of the last couple weeks as a handcuff. And with that, he will be given opportunity and hopefully can find himself in the end zone, because we know he's going to be given ample rushing attempts and receiving work. He just needs to find a rushing touchdown to be fantasy relevant, just like Rachaad White was last week against the San Francisco 49ers. Our number 27 for this week is Jerome Ford. The issue with Jerome Ford is that Kareem Hunt continues to be a relevant option within this backfield. Even though Jerome Ford got the rushing touchdown and Kareem Hunt didn't this week, that's the first time in the last 6 games in which that has occurred. Therefore, going forward, my expectation within this offense, considering they have a rookie backup quarterback, until they change to Joe Flacco, it's purely just going to be a matter of who scores the rushing touchdown. I understand this is an advantageous matchup taking on the Denver Broncos, but they just really need to stack the box and let their secondary force DTR to win the game. And if they do so, they should be able to stop the run against the Cleveland Browns attack, even though this offensive line has played extremely well. And even though the Denver Broncos are allowing 5.77 yards per attempt to opposing running backs since week 5, it's purely just a matter of who's going to find themselves in the end zone, Jerome Ford or Kareem Hunt. Moving on to our number 28, we have Devin Singletary. I am upset to rank him here, but there is a potential in which Dameon Pierce does return this week, because he did practice at a limited capacity on Friday of week 11. So if Dameon Pierce returns, he's going to get himself a workload of opportunity. It's not going to be the starting workload, but it definitely is going to dig into the opportunity of Devin Singletary. Despite the fact that Devin Singletary has had himself 52 rushing attempts, 262 rushing yards, and 2 rushing touchdowns, averaging 5.04 yards per attempt in the last 2 games, he does take on the second most difficult matchup, taking on the Jacksonville Jaguars, who are only allowing 3.43 yards per attempt since week 5. So with Dameon Pierce potentially coming back in a game in which they may be passing the ball even more, less opportunities going in the direction of Devin Singletary may lead to less potential fantasy upside. Hopefully he'll find himself in the end zone, but outside of that, it is a difficult matchup to say the least. Moving on to our number 29, we have Najee Harris. Najee Harris, again, taking on the Cincinnati Bengals. It's the 10th best matchup at the position. They're allowing over 4.3 yards per carry, over 14 fantasy points per game. But is he going to be given more opportunity than Jaylen Warren going forward? With the offensive coordinator change, my expectation is that Jaylen Warren may see himself more featured looks within this backfield in comparison, considering how effective he has been within this offense. But we know that Najee Harris is still going to be a mainstay because they want to continue to utilize this two-headed monster. With that all being taken into account, there have been a couple games as of late in which the Pittsburgh Steelers have played against backup quarterbacks. Now they have an opportunity of doing so against Cincinnati Bengals, but most recently against Tennessee, against the backup quarterback, Najee Harris, 14.5 fantasy points. This last week against the backup quarterback, not as great with 4.1 fantasy points, but if in fact the backup quarterback play in Cincinnati isn't great enough, that may lead to an advantage for the Pittsburgh Steelers, shorter field opportunities, and potentially a rushing touchdown for Najee Harris, which of course would get him into the top 24 capacity. Moving on to our number 30, we have James Conner. In my opinion, the fact that he is not getting himself enough receiving utilization and not finding himself, getting much red zone touchdown opportunities leads him to being, an RB3 this week. It isn't a great matchup, on top of the fact that Kyler Murray will always have the opportunity of stealing a touchdown down in the red zone. Unless James Conner is going to get himself 4 or 5 receptions per game, he really isn't anything better than a low-end RB3 in this overall capacity. The opportunity is there. He's going to get himself like 15 touches, but without a touchdown, it's not really worth much. Moving on to our number 31, we have A.J. Dillon. As of right now, Aaron Jones, of course, dealing with an MCL sprain. He is not going to be active on Thursday's game against the Detroit Lions. A.J. Dillon, thus far this season, in games in which he has been given the starting workload of opportunity, he has put up 6.8, 3.3, 13.6, and 8.1 fantasy points in those 4 games. Without a touchdown, it's a tough game for him. The fact that he takes on Detroit, that's a difficult matchup already. The fact that he's dealing with a groin injury himself, that is not easy. But in the last 3 games, the running backs of the Green Bay Packers have seen themselves a lot of opportunities within the receiving game. Green Bay Packers running backs have accumulated 8, 9, and 7 targets in the last 3 games. Those are pretty good numbers. 6 receptions for 44, 5 receptions for 30, 5 receptions for 29. As long as he gets himself a receiving utilization, he'll be relevant and a starting option for fantasy purposes. Moving on to our number 32, we have Khalil Herbert. With Deontay Foreman going down with the injury, of course, Deontay Foreman scored a rushing touchdown. The red zone opportunity is now going in the direction of Khalil Herbert. He's also going to be the primary RB1 in terms of rushing attempts for this team, similar to the way in which prior to his injury, he was. So going forward against the Minnesota Vikings, my expectation is a pretty good share of opportunity, 15 plus touches within the given week. And if in fact they have goal line opportunities, my expectation would be that Khalil Herbert would dominate those touches. Moving on to our number 33, we have Chuba Hubbard. Chuba Hubbard, again, he's splitting his overall touches about 50-50. In terms of his overall snaps, 50-50 with Miles Sanders, but he is still technically the starting option. They do take on the Tennessee Titans. The Titans are allowing over 15 fantasy points per game since week 5 to opposing running backs. In terms of rushing statistics, 4.3 yards per carry. My expectation will be a pretty solid week, especially considering Chuba Hubbard is coming off a performance in which he had, 10 carries for 57. My expectation is that if in fact this game is a lower scoring contest and there isn't really a negative game script, more rushing attempts for Chuba Hubbard in the second half could lead him to potentially falling into the end zone. Moving on to our number 34, speaking of falling into the end zone, Kareem Hunt must get a rushing touchdown. Otherwise, it's just all shambles for him within a given week. Only 5.2 fantasy points, had himself 12 total rushing attempts, just as many as Jerome Ford, 3 total receptions, more than Jerome Ford. If he's going to get himself just as many, if not more touches within a given week, of course, just as relevant, but he technically does need that rushing upside. It's kind of a 50-50 between the two of them. And if anything, as of late, Kareem Hunt has been the preferred goal line back. Maybe he'll go ahead and be the guy that scores more points out of this backfield within the given week. Who knows? Moving on to our number 35, we have Alexander Mattison, and number 36, Ty Chandler. I wanted to mention both these running backs back-to-back, primarily because at this current moment in time, the expectation is that both these guys should get, a pretty good ample share of opportunity. They do take on the toughest matchup at the running back position, taking on the Chicago Bears. But we just all saw most recently the Detroit Lions with Jahmyr Gibbs and David Montgomery with an elite offensive line dominate the matchup in that overall capacity. I don't know if the Minnesota Vikings offensive line is technically capable of doing so. So we're going to be a little bit cautious with these two. But technically, they're both going to be relevant for fantasy purposes because I expect them both to get an ample volume of touches within the given week. All right, that's going to cover it in terms of my top 36 running back rankings for week 12. Thank you everybody for watching. I'll be back tomorrow with my wide receiver rankings at a top 40 capacity. Until then, do not forget, if you guys want my rankings up to date every Sunday for the remainder of the season, be sure to check out Underdog Fantasy. Use code Andrew. Make that first time deposit minimum of $10, and I'll send you that email every single Sunday morning. And also, specifically this upcoming Thursday, because again, there's 3 games on this Thursday, Thanksgiving. Also, don't forget, for those of you who want to take advantage of the 25% off Thanksgiving sale of all hoodies via the 1.01 brand, be sure to travel down to the description of the video and check out AndrewKirchhoffShop.com. All hoodies, whether they are the special edition tie-dye hoodies or the primary color hoodies, are all 25% off. So be sure to check that out. Take advantage of the opportunity until next Monday. And then after next Monday is gone, all these products will be retired and off into the wind. Thank you very much. And until next time, I'll see you guys. Peace.